The Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, I hope you would consider joining if you haven't already, and you can go online to lewisandclark.org. I also want to mention, probably a lot of you have visited Travelers Rest State Park next door, and they're having their annual auction again this year, which is a fun event, and it'll be March 2nd on Friday at 6 p.m. And this year it's going to be at the UC Ballroom. And Colleen back there is taking, if you'd like to get a ticket to the auction, Colleen can fill you in and help you get a ticket. There's going to be a lot of gift cards at the auction, a carved chainsaw bear. How many of you have a carved chainsaw bear already? There's going to be a fire pit with s'mores and blankets. I don't know if the fire is going to be going at the auction. Birdhouse, original paintings, photographs, etc. And that's coming up March 2nd. We're glad that MCAT is here tonight. Mary is recording the program for our local Missoula Community Access Television. It'll eventually air on cable TV on channel 189. And then if we request, these programs go on to YouTube. Our next speaker next month is Stephen Glukert. He was recently with the Missoula Arts Museum for many years. And he's going to be giving a program called Over Our Shoulders, Looking Back, 20 Artists Working in Montana from 1810 to 1945. And it's a unique program because he focuses on some artists that I'm not familiar with, and perhaps many others aren't as well. And then in April, I'm delighted that Sarah Scott, she's an archaeologist with the Montana State Parks, and she has done a lot of research on the Buffalo Road, the trail that Meriwether Lewis followed on his shortcut from here in 1806, going back to the falls of the Missouri. And Sarah's going to be speaking about that trail, especially the archaeological sites along the way in April. But tonight, Kevin O'Brien is our speaker. Kevin and I have spent a lot of time along the Lewis and Clark Trail in the summer, working especially with Lewis and Clark Trail Adventures, on adventures along the Lewis and Clark Trail. But Kevin recently, last year, presented a Molly class that some of you may have attended, and he'll be giving another Molly class this spring about the archaeology of cuisine. And he could tell you more about it later if he's over there now. Kevin's talk tonight is a special interest to me, having portrayed William Clark for many years. William Clark was the map maker, and it's interesting that Lewis and Clark, they got a lot of help from the Indians, and their maps were quite useful. They may have gathered or seen about 30 maps, collected many of them. And with that, I would like to introduce you and welcome Kevin O'Brien.
I feel like I'm in a church hall. This reminds me of going to the church back in Oklahoma when I was a kid. It's a revival. This is a historical revival. Give me that old-time religion. Give me. I am an archaeologist, and today I'm going to be talking about the contributions of native maps to the mapping of, well, the conquest, the colonization, the mapping of the entire continent was completely dependent on the information and directions given by native guides and native cartographers. And is this mic working the way it's supposed to? We're good? Okay. Barely. All right, we'll see if I'll be loud. All right, so just a little bit about my bona fides, so you know I'm not a crank. I do teach a class for the Molly program at the University of Montana this spring on Tuesday nights from 6 to 7:30. The Archaeology of Cuisine, where I'll be talking about how food contributes to the understanding of human history and human migration throughout the world. So small plug, and you should also attend Sarah Scott's lecture. She's great, that's good stuff about the Lolo Trail. I've worked in 14 different states and on different projects as a cultural resource management archaeologist. I work in compliance, so a lot of the work I've done has been associated with environmental impact studies, road work, that kind of thing. But that doesn't dampen my interest in finding interesting projects to work at. So far I've worked in prehistoric, historic slave archaeology. I've done stuff that's like the if you've heard of the Alaska Way Viaduct project, there I am 9 years ago in downtown Seattle, making way for that thing to be done already. I've worked in Colorado on prehistoric Ute sites. I've worked on the historic Fort Walla Walla sites. And I also do a trip with a guy who looks a lot like William Clark on the Missouri River in the summer. So let me get into the topic at hand. And I attended the University of Chicago as an undergraduate and graduate school at the University of New Mexico. I spent about 5 years doing research on a middle woodland site in Illinois, a mound builder site about 2,000 years old. So anyway, so what I want to talk about now is a map that was recently found about 2 years ago by a historian at the University of Nebraska named Christopher Steinke. This map turned up at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the French National Library, and it is a map drawn by a Native American in 1804 named Tune, or Arkita Narshar, or Inkita Netero. So the inscription on the map says, and that's above here, Dessiné par, so drawn by Inkita Netero, Grand Chief of the Arikara Nation, who died in Washington on the 6th of April, 1806, Joseph Graveline, Canadian, commissioned and interpreted, given to Honoré Julien. And so the sort of bizarre chain of events that led this map going from the middle Missouri River with the Lewis and Clark expedition. And the Lewis and Clark expedition are on the map. Here we have the council with the Arikara drawn on the map with a little stick figure marked Captain Lewis and a little stick figure marked Captain Clark. Down here we have their meeting with the Arikara, with the Mandan and Hidatsa at the Great Bend in Missouri. Tune went with them upriver and attended that conference. So he was the guy that is sometimes referred to as, in the journals, as the third chief, or Piaheto, which means eagle feather. And he's also referred to as Arkita Narshar and Tune. Arkita Narshar is just a long form, and Tune is a short form of the same word, and it means village chief. And he came from the sort of third village of the Arikara that the Lewis and Clark expedition encountered in October of 1804. And when they showed up at these villages, these were a group of people that had consolidated from being many villages due to multiple smallpox epidemics. They had finally coalesced into 3 small villages at the northern end of their historic range. And when the expedition shows up, they are looking for people that they can make negotiations with, make deals with, make treaties with, and they need leaders. And so they effectively go into communities that have been decimated, where you have the leaders of many villages, in some cases, living in a single village. And so Tune was a very respected man. He spoke 11 languages. He was well-traveled. He was sort of appointed the chief guy of that third Arikara village because of his status, not because he was the chief. He was a chief, but not necessarily the chief of that village. So he was a man of high rank. So Tune is a short term for Grand Chief. Arkita Narshar, Inkita Netero is a long term in Arikara for Great Chief as well. So this map gets taken, it's drawn by Tune while he's wintering over in St. Louis, waiting to go to Washington. And Joseph Graveline goes along with him as an interpreter. Tune's chosen to be the Arikara ambassador because he has this language ability, because he's so well-traveled. He's valued as an ambassador. So obviously he should go and meet Jefferson. He gets sick while he's in St. Louis. He travels to Washington anyway. He visits Philly. He visits Baltimore. He's sort of appreciated by the people who meet him for the very expressive way that he uses the Indian Sign Language. People who met him note that he had this extraordinary ability to make himself understood just by hand gestures. So this was part of his sort of diplomatic package. Unfortunately, he passed away while he was in Washington, and Jefferson actually wrote a letter of condolence where he's not entirely clear what this guy's name is, because he's called 3 or 4 different things, and he scratches out the name and writes in another one, and then finally says, you know, just figure it out sort of thing. And so when he dies, it's a bit of a scandal. There is conflict between the United States and the Arikara afterward, and people have a hard time moving upriver because they're angry that this person has died that they sent to Washington. So anyway, Jefferson gives this map to Honoré Julienne, and people who met Touné in Washington found the map to be very peculiar and didn't really know quite what to make of it. And we'll get more into how to understand and interpret Touné's map in order to understand why this man was walking around Washington showing this bizarre picture to everybody that he met is important. This is a diplomatic document, and it was poorly understood as such. And after Touné died, it was given to Jefferson's chef. That's who Honoré Julienne is. I don't know why. Any insight into this is something I would like to learn more about, so I'm throwing that out to the wider community. It was given at some point to the French ambassador, Guy de Neuville, who had a niece who had an interest in painting Native Americans. And it's somehow passed into her hands, and then she donated it to the French National Library in 1905, and it just sort of disappeared into the records until people started digitizing things. So this thing has cropped back up, and it raises a lot of interesting questions about the sorts of maps that Clark was using as he was going up the Missouri River and sort of mapping the interior of North America. What did these maps look like that these native informants were providing him with? And this map gives us a wonderful example. Even though this was not a map that was used by the Lewis and Clark expedition, Touné walked along the riverbank with William Clark and described things to him as a tour guide would, talking about the stories that go along with the landscape, as this was a very storied landscape for the Arikara people who'd lived there for centuries. And in order to sort of understand what Touné's map means, and we'll get back to more pictures of it later, and I can tell you where to find it online if you want to look at it yourself. We need to understand what the difference is between what we think of as a map, a topographical map, a sort of Western scientific European-style map, a Cartesian map, if you will, and an indigenous map, and how those things differ. We need to understand how early European maps of New France, French Louisiana, and New Spain were relying on these indigenous maps. So as people like Jacques Cartier were going up the St. Lawrence, they were encountering native informants who were drawing them maps, and they mentioned these drawings in their journals. And so that's how we have maps from early on where explorers have drawn places that they have not been. We need to realize that some colonial cartographers thought of native maps as sort of sketchy or somehow invalid information for their sort of modern positivist maps that they were making with these linear senses of scale. On the other hand, there were European cartographers who chose to use native style maps, and instead of incorporating native geographic information into a European style map, they would just use native style maps because they found that they worked just as well, even though they looked different. Finally, we're going to talk about how these kinds of maps contributed to the maps used by the Lewis and Clark expedition and the ones that they drew as well. So the first thing that needs to be understood is sort of what is the difference, what is this dichotomy between an indigenous and a Western or European map. There are these sort of two implied notions that spring to mind when you think about them, that the indigenous is traditional and that the Western is scientific. And whereas the indigenous map is traditional, it's just as scientific as the Western map. It's just sort of recording different information using a slightly different vocabulary. So whereas a topographic map or a hydrological map that we're used to seeing today is very empirical and reliant on sort of scientific observations to make sure that things are accurate in Cartesian space, an indigenous map is usually very schematic or symbolic, which is often kind of like the sorts of information maps that we're used to today, or schematic subway maps, or those kinds of symbolic maps that we often use to categorize information that's too complex to be visualized, such as computer networks. The linear scale of a scientific map is always based on measured distance. And in indigenous maps, it's usually based on travel time. So if a place going from point A to point B is 3 sleeps, and it's an especially rough road, but it's not very far in linear space, it's going to be drawn as very distant on an indigenous map. Whereas something that's an easy walk, even if it's very far, is going to be very short on an indigenous map. So there's going to be this sort of distorted sense of scale. Indigenous maps can be political, they can be hydrological, they can be topographic, but they're not necessarily so. Whereas a Western scientific map is attempting to sort of include all of physical space into this sort of model. Finally, the indigenous map includes extra information that the Western scientific map doesn't include, that can include the cosmological, folkloric, the mytho-historic, religious implications in these maps, in the same sense that we think about the trails that a pilgrim will follow, sacred routes that tie one to one's religion. So if we think about symbolic maps, and what I mean by that, an example of a symbolic map or a schematic map would be a phylogenetic map that shows the sort of evolutionary and genetic relationships between different living things. So that's a type of schematic map that has a similar appearance to a native map. Or a schematic map of the human circulatory system. We can understand how the blood flows through the body without these organs being anatomically accurate. Or over here we have a circuit diagram is a great example of a sort of schematic map that is a lot like an indigenous map, in that we know that a pocket FM radio doesn't look like that, but this describes how it works. So in some sense, when we talk about indigenous geography, what we're talking about is hodology, which in geography is the study of paths, and in philosophy it's the study of interconnected ideas, and in neuroscience it's the study of the patterns of connections in your brain. And hodology is important when we're talking about maps like Tunes because of the importance of narratives to place, what we call the sort of locus of memory. Amongst the Aboriginal people of Australia, you may have heard of Ayers Rock. There always, you see travel things of Australia, there's this big, smooth-looking orange rock. Everyone know what I'm talking about here? Or it's Uluru is what it's called in the indigenous language. If you get up close to it, it's covered in little crenellations. And this rock is an important locus of memory for Aboriginal Australians who will walk around it, at least the historians among them, will walk around it and touch each crenellation and tell a story, and can walk all the way around this rock. And they have recorded some 10,000 years of their history by remembering a thing and associating it with a place. And so they sort of read the landscape, read the rock. So this is why when one of Albert Kroeber, Ishi, the last Yahi Indian, he had a student named Watterson, and Thomas Watterson, who was interested in what Ishi's place names were for various things and wrote those down obsessively. And then he got interested in all sorts of different native place names and started making crazy, elaborate topographic maps, including every little name for every little thing that he could find from a native informant. And what he discovered was that there was this unusual pattern to the way things were named, in that the way a European will name something, see a large object and give it a name like a mountain, in some cases the mountain wouldn't have a name, but several spots on it would, like an important rock, an important tree, an important place where an important story happened. And so it was all these little things, these loci of memory that were important about the mountain, not the mountain itself. So in that sense, narratives for a lot of native groups, when they talk about their oral histories, there's these litanies of place names. And people, when they talk about place names, it's sort of a form of traveling through those places in their minds. An anthropologist was talking to an Apache cowboy who was sitting there muttering to himself for about 10 minutes, just rattling off place names and spitting chewing tobacco juice. And finally, when he was done, the guy was like, "What was that all about? Why were you rattling off place names for 10 minutes? And the guy said, "Oh, because they're good to talk." And that litany of place names is a way for him to travel in his mind through the landscape, the storied landscape that he inhabited. And so in the same sense that landscape has stories, when we move through landscape, we come to know it. So we sort of make our world by moving through it. And map making for indigenous cartographers and storytelling were tied together. You wouldn't draw a map for hydrological and topographical information unless, of course, some guy who just rolled into town is asking you for directions. Then, yeah, okay, I'll draw you a map. And there's a circle, here's a lake, here's a road, and you make a right here. And so they draw these highly schematic maps with just directions if that's what they're for. But this is part of a tradition of making maps in order to tell stories of migrations, tell stories that connect the people to the landscape. So let's get to the whole Lewis and Clark thing, since this is a Lewis and Clark group. So this map we're looking at here and is Nicholas King's map. So before the Lewis and Clark expedition left, Albert Gallatin, the Secretary of the Treasury for Jefferson, commissions this map. And so King makes this map where there's absolutely nothing on it that's quote-unquote conjectural. And they were very concerned about there being conjectural information in these maps. These were supposed to be the most scientific, the most up-to-date, the most Jeffersonian maps that you could get, right? And so rather than assume anything about the interior, people, water, rocky mountains, or otherwise, it was left blank. Here is a place to write a new republic. It's Jeffersonian expansionism on paper. And part of the reason why we have these Rocky Mountains that stop right here is because Alexander Mackenzie went through and he saw Rocky Mountains going to the south, but he couldn't really say if they went any further than what he saw. And so they were left off. And so while this map was made for the expedition, they often consulted instead this map made by Aaron Arrowsmith, which Nicholas King drew heavily on, but he erased all the important bits. And what those bits were generally speaking, the native bits. So here is sort of a pre-positivist, Cartesian way of looking at a map. What we have is a map of New Netherland, and it looks very confusing because it looks like it's on the west coast. And that's because this map has the north going to the right. And these sort of like late medieval, early modern maps are stylistically kind of weird. There's a little bit of accuracy to the sort of coastline. If you orient it the right way, you can see that here's Cape Cod, and there's Massachusetts right there, Bay of Fundy, here's Long Island. And we have Indians coming out in canoes to meet the ships. which was an important thing to remember about the frontier at that point. It was fishing boats of different sorts running into each other at sea, so contact was happening well outside of land, and we have interior people and animals sort of doing their thing in here. So the map is trying to suggest some knowledge of what goes on in the interior. Here's another early English map. This is showing Long Island, and once again we have some Indians out in canoes, presumably whaling, and various features inland as well. So in order to talk about sort of how Nicholas's map or Aaron Arrowsmith's map, how these maps were made, we need to sort of look at these sort of three sort of intrusions into the American interior. And so that's going to require looking at North America from three directions. The first is we're going to look at it through Canada. And then we're going to look at it from Louisiana, French Louisiana, so what's going on as the French are pushing northward up the Mississippi, and what's going on in Mexico. So first we're going to talk about New France. So New France, of course, you know, they didn't last long, but they were there, and they made an awful lot of maps, and a lot of them are not very Jeffersonian at all. So we have this early 1616 Samuel de Champlain map of La Canada. And Champlain's route was strictly along the sort of northern edge of the St. Lawrence drainage. And so you have these sort of assumptions and distortions that are born of that. So down here we have effectively this like itty-bitty, well, we've got a, which one is this? Lake Ontario seems about right. And then they sort of follows the north shore of Georgian Bay, and Georgian Bay becomes this huge lake. And down here we have these like itty-bitty little stumps of Lakes Erie and Lake Huron. And so this is a very odd map. We have this rectangular islands up here in the Hudson's Bay, and we have this assumption about the Arctic extending far south into the northwest. And so, like, Champlain had not been to all of these places. He'd strictly followed this sort of northern bank, and he'd heard about Lake Superior. And so he drew these things on his maps. And there are no copies of it, but in 1607, he had gone as far as here on the St. Lawrence and spoke to an Algonquian man who drew him a map and explained where all of the rapids were further downriver. And he actually had those on his own records. As he proceeded, he relied on this Algonquian man's map. So he had maps of places he had not been yet in 1607. As he sort of ventures further and further, he increases his knowledge of the Great Lakes. Things start getting a little less sketchy. But you know, we still have weird rectangular islands in Hudson's Bay, and we have things that, you know, are sort of maps of places he had not been yet, like this weird map of Lake Nipissing, and it has Saults or rapids marked all around it, but these are not places that Champlain went to directly. He was relying on native cartographic information in order to derive this kind of weird-looking, distorted map. Joliet and Marquette moved down the Mississippi River in 1673. They made this really weird-looking map, and so once again, north is to the right-hand side, and they only descended as far as the Arkansas River, and they heard, oh, there's Spanish down there, so they turned around and headed back. At no point did they go up the Missouri River, but they mapped it, and they marked people living up it. And they were relying on native intelligence. They've got the Missouri people down here, the Kansa, and of course the ever-present Pawnee, which was a catch-all for them for anybody they didn't know the name of. Oh, and this weird little bison down here, isn't that cool? Yeah, the boeuf sauvage. But not every European was sort of cartographically or spatially intelligent. We have this terrible map that I actually just found today in the French National Archive. I was just kind of going through because I'm down this horrible rabbit hole right now. And so this was made by this sort of the survivor of La Salle's doomed expedition in 1687, where he was going to go raid the Spanish, and a drunken boatman sank their only ship in Matagorda Bay, and which is archaeologically very well preserved. And then they killed La Salle, and then they killed the guy who killed La Salle. And so Sieur de Couture, who is a footnote in history, was the third in command. And so he drew this terrible map of, so we have right here, I blew it up, it's in this place they killed Monsieur de La Salle. And so they killed La Salle on the Brazos River, which flows into the Gulf of Mexico, but not on this map. The Brazos River is flowing into what looks like the Mississippi. And this river here, the La Vaca River, which flows into Matagorda Bay, is conflated with the Rio Grande. So like this, de Couture had no idea where he was. He was completely lost. That's why they were like killing each other and wandering around in the forest. So in 1703, Guillaume de Lille started making some better maps of New France based on all this data that people like Marquette and Joliet and Champlain were compiling, and tried to make them sort of consistent, but they're still highly conjectural in the sense that there is not just a reliance on indigenous maps to complete them, but there's a reliance on assumption that places that they didn't even have native maps of, that they knew what it would look like. And a lot of these assumptions are sort of based on wishful thinking, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a second. So just to sort of put us where we are at this point, so they've mapped about this far, and then de la Vendrée comes on the scene. And de la Vendrée goes out, and he's sort of noteworthy because he was one of the first Europeans to go down to the Mandan villages at the Great Bend of the Missouri. And he came back up, and when he was out and about, he collected maps from people. So here is his sort of journal entry where he mentions the Mandan. The nations about 300 leagues further down are sedentary, raise crops, and for lack of wood, make themselves mud huts. When de la Vendrée's out and about, he collects this map from a Cree man named Ochagach. And so he copies Ochagach's map, and then he brings it back to Quebec. And in Quebec, he gives it to the royal cartographer Gaspard Chaussegros, big shoes, de Larry. De Larry copies de la Vendrée's copy of Ochagach's map. So just to give you a sense of what this map is of, so he copied it upside down in this case. This is real good work on his part. So north is now down, whereas here it's up. And then we have, this is Lake of the Woods, and this is Lake Winnipeg. They're not right next to each other. So de Larry makes a copy, and he corrects that, So he realizes Ochagach is using this other set, kind of scale, so he takes into account sleeps. But then this weird thing happens, and there's this little detail that's hard to read, and it says Fleuve de West, all right, the river of the West. And this is conjectural. And this is based on wishful thinking, because Lake Winnipeg here, I don't know if you heard about, I think it was last winter or the winter before that, they had these weird winds that were driving heaps of snow up onto the banks, and it was like crushing houses, and you know what I'm talking about? Anyway, so like Lake Winnipeg has those kinds of winds that will drive the water up one side or the other, and the phenomenon, when it was described to these early French explorers who really, really, really wanted there to be an easy northwest passage, about this lake that has these tidal-like phenomena, and isn't that interesting? And they latched onto that and assumed, oh, it's a tidal river. It must be connected to the Pacific. So if we just follow Ochagach's route, we're going to get to the Great River of the West. So the River of the West becomes a thing at this point. And here it is in a sort of, all these map makers, this guy was in Amsterdam, I believe, but writing in French, and they're making these sort of compilation maps of all this stuff and getting them out there, and this guy's copied, look at Ochagach's map, and right here, Fleuve de l'Ouest, right? Here it is again, 1754, and this time it's actually published as a canoe route, so somebody figured out what this was for. And now we go flash forward to 1755, so this is the beginning of the French and Indian War, and the English are starting to take an interest in all this stuff the French people have been mapping. And so we have this map, that John Mitchell's map, made right before the French and Indian War. And if we zoom in on the upper part here, what do we have? Ochagach's map. There it is again. And we also have some interesting data on the upper Missouri. So here we are, here's the Missouri, and right here it says, thus far the French ascend the Missouri. So this is the Mandan villages labeled Pawnees, because we don't know what they're called. And we have the Omaha in a couple of different places. And so this is some, some vague information out here, but it's assumed that the river continues in a northwesterly direction. Once again, wishful thinking. And the British were also relying on native intelligence. This map was drawn during the French and Indian War to try to find out information about groups of people who were allied with the French out on the Mississippi. So an Indian named Chegaree, and that's all we know, and it's a note right here on the map, made by Chegaree. And Chegaree draws this highly schematic map. The recognizable feature here, and then some unknown British official drew notes on it. So we have Lake Erie. This is the Ohio River. These are tributaries running off of the Ohio River. This is the Mississippi, and here he's marked French Indians, French Indians, French Indians. And then we have a footpath as well that can connect you to that place. So it's got trails, it has rivers, and it has geographic information as well, where the sort of sleeps have been translated and they've written in actual miles, like it says 120 miles right here. So after de la Vendrée, when the sort of English step in on the scene, the Hudson's Bay Company just goes gangbusters, and they go all over the place and they map everything. And you end up with Alexander Mackenzie. He makes it all the way across, and he makes this map that Nicholas King got his very cautious little conservative map from, where, well, he stops where he doesn't know where things are. It doesn't mean that there's nothing there. It just means he can't prove it, which I commend. So now we need to look at the view from French Louisiana. So Guillaume de Lille is making lots of maps and compiling information on river systems as well. And here we have a map where, once again, we're relying on native information about what's actually going on upriver in these places. These are places beyond which the French do not ascend. And then we have assumptions about things like the Rio Grande. And the Rio Grande must come here, and the Missouri must come here, because here is this hypothesized pyramidal height of land that all the great geographers of the day were convinced was there. So in the absence of any evidence, assume something ridiculous. There's a pyramid there, and all the rivers meet conveniently in one place. So this map is the kinds of maps that de Lille would have been using, although it's much more recent. And what's really fascinating about this map is it's from 1795. It was made by the King of Spain's Surveyor General of Upper Louisiana, and Antoine Soulard. He was a guy who fled France because they were going to guillotine him. And he came via Massachusetts, went down the Ohio River, and got to St. Louis that way. He was a farmer. He was not a cartographer. And he got maps from fur traders, people like Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, these guys who were going out from St. Louis and collecting native maps and using native maps to get from point A to point B. They were using the kinds of maps that their customers and clientele used, right? So they're trading with Indians. We'll use Indian maps. We all understand each other, right? So Soulard is relying on traders who are relying on native maps, and he draws this very oddly accurate in its own way, but very native map of upper Louisiana, where there's no real Cartesian organization here. North-south is all screwy. This is the Missouri River. This is the Great Bend of the Missouri. This is the Mississippi River. It's just like, what, you know? But it's like, if you get close to it, it's actually a very sensible and sort of schematic way, because it's based on sleeps, and it's based on important geographical things being given the importance they should have. So this is more like a subway map than it is a river map. We have important villages, and circles mean that they're permanent residences, and triangles mean that they're temporary residences, so teepees. And so this little teepee symbol is something that comes from, it's a native cartographic convention. And it makes its way onto these maps that these explorers are using, or in this case, the government of Spain. And the reason why they were using it, Trudeau says it perfectly well. They do not have any knowledge of geography or other sciences. They make descriptions on parchments that are the most correct in the world of the country they know. And that's the sort of key piece here. They're schematic, but they're accurate. This is, as far as I know, the oldest map of Montana, and it's a tracing because it's hard to see. And it's based on a native map. John Thomas Evans was one of the guys that Soulard was sending upriver to find information for him. And he was also helping out the local economy of St. Louis by mapping things and finding new customers. And so up here we have a map of, here's the, oh, good Lord, a map of the Missouri River. And here's the Mandan villages, the Great Bend. Here we have the Little Missouri, we have the Yellowstone, and we have the Crow villages, and we have the Chevatoon. And this was a thing of quite a bit of conjecture for a while. Chevatoon was a name for a band of people variously called like the Saulteaux, who eventually merged with the Cheyenne and moved further south. So they kind of disappeared from the scene. Here we have the Milk River, we have the Musselshell River, we have the Great Falls of the Missouri, and then we have Jean du Serpent, the Shoshone, the Rocky Mountains, and then this implication of a river being on the other side. And then, so guys like Mackey and Evans were going out and compiling these maps, and when the Lewis and Clark expedition shows up at Camp Du Bois in 1803, they come out and offer directions and give the expedition maps to work with. And this map is from St. Charles, which is down at the mouth of the Missouri, all the way up to the Mandan villages, which is what's highlighted over here on the right. So this map that was used by the Lewis and Clark expedition is a copy of a copy. It's a bunch of native maps compiled into a master map that the Lewis and Clark expedition then used to find their way up to the Mandan villages. And the kinds of maps that Evans and Mackey and Soulard would have been seeing looked like these kinds of maps. This is an 1825 Odo map of the Missouri and Arkansas rivers, and this map was drawn in order to describe the history of his people. Here's the same thing done by an Iowa informant, where he's drawn the various towns and migratory routes. So these maps are historical documents. They're stories. They're about movements through the landscape. And they also happen to be hydrologically very interesting and very useful, although highly schematic. And this convention continues through time and sort of enters into what we call the ledger art tradition. And so we have over here an Indian scout that was at the Battle of Little Bighorn drew this map to describe the action. And here we have that old convention of using triangles to indicate a campground and dotted lines to indicate paths, lines to indicate rivers. And over here on the right, we have a similar location where Gouverneur K. Warren, in his 1855 mapping of the upper Missouri, he draws an Indian encampment using that same mapping convention. And this ledger art tradition can be conflated with the rock art tradition, with the mapping tradition. The symbols are largely the same, where this is people standing in a circular line and they're holding guns. And this is a path, and this is a village or fort in the middle. We see it in rock art. This is writing on stone in Alberta. Here's, people walking in a path. We have that symbol for teepees or a temporary encampment. So now we're going to look at the view from New Spain. So this sort of conquistadors using native maps was part of the game from the get-go with New Spain. Cortez, when he was invading Mexico in 1519, wrote these letters, like one per year, for King Charles V. His second letter of October 30th of 1520, he mentions that the Indians brought me a cloth on which the whole coast was drawn, showing a river larger than the others flowing into the sea. In his third letter to King Charles V on May 15th of 1522, he writes, on Holy Saturday, the Chalcans, the people of Chalco, and some of their allies and friends sent to tell me that the Mexicans were marching against them, and they showed me on a large white cloth a drawing of all the towns which were to march and the roads by which they were coming. So the kinds of maps that he's talking about are what the Spanish would eventually call lienzos, which means big sheet. And so here is a sort of schematic of a lienzo from Oaxaca. And these were valuable to the Spanish because they were effectively a feudal society taking over another feudal society. And it was easy enough for them to just sort of get the Aztecs that were in charge to keep doing what they were doing and keep the sort of documentary record largely the same. So maps like a lienzo would indicate not just places where people lived, it gave their Nahuatl names. It often included Nahuatl glyphs that would indicate the kinds of resources that were available there for taxation. And once again, these lienzos are pretty much schematic, like all these other native traditions, and schematic in the sense of here we have the modern-day Mexico City subway system, the Mexico City Metro. It's the second largest in North America. And here we have the map that's put out by the actual transit authority. And on the right, we have the map that's put out by the city of Mexico City, where they've superimposed the train routes onto their surface street map. And so this one is topographically accurate, but this one is schematic. This is more like the Indigenous map, because what happens above the subway is of no concern to you when you're in the subway. You're just going from stop to stop, station, you need to make a right, and when you need to know about the surface streets, you'll worry about it when you get up there. And so if you imagine how people are moving through landscapes like the Great Plains, where you would walk where there's water, you walk through valleys, places that you can follow, you don't wander out above unless you have to or there's a known way to go. So there was a sort of subway aspect to the way maps were drawn. And these maps were part of a larger documentary record called a Shupawali, which is the Nahuatl word for a year count, which is also a word for what they called a history. And these were leather-bound codices, that often had maps in them that recorded the history of their people. And these documents were not meant to be read, but performed. So a historian would perform the text. And in the same way that they would perform a map like this one. This is called the Sigüenza map, and it's the only map of its kind that survives today. It shows a map of the legendary Aztec journey from their mythical city of Aztlan, where they originated, to Tenochtitlan. And it has on it the route that they took, all of the important elements, the Nahuatl glyphs for the various places that they visited, and it also had histories of the important people that came along the journey, names of kings written above their heads, and the route marked with these adorable little footprint symbols. And here we have a Nahuatl glyph for a particular place and the number of days that they stayed there. And then the word is written out using Latin characters in Nahuatl. And Nahuatl is the Aztec language. It was the most widely spoken language in Mesoamerican at the time of Cortez's invasion, because the Aztecs were, the imperial power at that point. So here is a later codex from 1584. This is another lienzo, and it's showing lands for taxation purposes. So we have two rivers, and if we zoom in on it, we have the agricultural products that are available there. We have noteworthy people and their Nahuatl glyphs, and we have markings of things like churches on this map. When things get serious, like it's about money, the maps get even more detailed. This map was part of a court case where a Tlatoani, which was a Aztec sort of traditional chieftain, sort of the feudal lord of this given place. He gets killed in the Spanish Inquisition. He was executed, and his heirs were fighting over these fruit trees, and it required this detailed reckoning of all of the lands, and we have these Nahuatl numbers and Nahuatl glyphs, and I have no idea what any of this means, but it's a very detailed lienzo. And this was also, something that was happening up on the plains as well. This is not just in Mexico. This is a Lakota winter count, where what's Shupawali means a year count. This is a similar idea, a way to record events over time. And they also drew maps, but the maps were related to the stars. And a lot of groups that lived out on the plains had a mental map that connected the celestial to the earth. And so they could walk out at night and know where they were. They had this map that they could look at. And these Lakota maps have stars and a symbol to indicate the connection between the star and the point on Earth that was a sort of upside-down triangle above a regular triangle. And this was based on the idea of the teepee, and that the cone of the teepee had this opposite cone that came out at the top that sort of encompassed the universe. And so it was a very sort of sacred thing. And I can't show you a picture of these maps because they won't let anybody see them. They're part of medicine bundles, and you can't see them. But this is something that they might look like. This is a Pawnee star map. The Pawnee also mapped their world to the heavens as a way of keeping track of things, and they would draw these star maps on hides, and these correspond to various terrestrial geographical locations. So an interesting thing happened in 1602 when Wanda Oñate invaded Kansas, and he gets in a little battle with some late Mississippian Caddoan people and takes a prisoner that he dubs Miguel from the town of Tonkawa, and brings him back to Mexico City and puts him in front of the royal cartographer and is made to draw a map. And this is what he drew. And so we have this highly schematic map, and we have a couple of rivers and some towns and some paths. And so here it is a little easier to see, and oriented in a north-south direction. And it's a sort of schematic map of the world that Miguel lived in. And he's got the Arkansas River here, and here's the Great Bend of the Arkansas, and he's got the Salt Fork River here, and then all of the communities surrounding those places and the town that he's from. The battle that happened between Oñate and Miguel's people was down here, and they recently found this archaeological site that sort of matched up these two events. So we have archaeological evidence for Wanda Oñate's battle at this particular place that Miguel drew. And there's this other tradition that comes out of the far north, and it's an Ojibwe tradition called Wigwasabak, and it's associated with the Midewiwin societies. And these scrolls are only unrolled at special ceremonial occasions, and they include multiple types of information. This is a geographic map, highly schematic, of the route from the St. Lawrence Seaway along the north side, kind of that route that Champlain took, over Lake Superior, and then finally to Leech Lake in the boundary waters of Minnesota. And in it, there is this thing that this is Lake Superior, but this is also a medicine lodge. There's a Midewiwin bark scroll of a medicine lodge. And so Lake Superior was a vast medicine lodge. And this map describes the journey that the Midewiwin religion took as it moved from the St. Lawrence Seaway into the place where the Ojibwe live today. And so it is a history, it is a geography, it is a movement through space, and it's a religious document, so it's also the path in a spiritual sense. So it's a spiritual journey, and this Midewiwin initiate understands this as a spiritual journey. And this symbol shows up. There's a great depth, time depth to this mapping tradition. Here is a rock art piece from Lake of the Woods in Western Ontario where we see something that looks a lot like a migration map, and then we have this symbol of the medicine lodge. We see sort of schematic diagrams that look a lot like the rivers and lakes on Champlain or Ochagach's map here at this rock art site in southern Illinois. This interesting piece is found at the commerce site. Thebes Gap is right down in where the Ohio and the Mississippi meet. And there's this rock like lying near the easiest portage across the Mississippi, and it has these things etched in it that if you orient it towards the bend in the river, the archaeological sites, these Mississippian, so circa 900 to 1200 AD sites, correspond to these pecked places on the rock itself. And then we have this site that was taken by Lee Silliman, who's usually at these things. He gave me this. This is down in Du Bois, Wyoming. It's a Dinwoody tradition rock art site, so it's got a pretty broad date range there. But if you look at this thing here, we see what looks like a migration map. We have drainages, lakes, and what appear to be paths going between those features. We have things up in the far northeast. This is up around Maine, Quebec. This Micmac drawing, it's a notice that says we have 10 enemy warriors in canoes, and they're heading to the lake, and they're going to the outlet that goes to the river. We have a Penobscot birch bark map. We have lakes, and we have beaver dams. We have paths between the lakes, and we have an encounter between two people. And we also have dwellings and paths between those things. The Catawba Chickasaw of Carolina and the far southeast made highly schematic maps that indicated how various communities connected to one another, and both politically and geographically. We have this wonderful example of a map that was drawn for the Royal Governor of Carolina, Francis Nicholson, in 1721 by a Catawba chief. And in it, he draws the political relationships of all the important groups of native polities that were living in the Carolina Piedmont at the time. But he also includes things that are much further afield. We have the Cherokees out here. And we have, so things that are far off in space are close by. And the reason for that, of course, is that they have a relationship with Charleston, as the Catawba have a relationship with Charleston, although they don't necessarily have a direct relationship with each other. They have an indirect relationship through these guys. And over here, we have this very peculiar thing, and this represents an Iroquois warrior with a war club, and he's threatening all of this. And so the alliance between us and Charleston and Virginia is very important for protection against the Iroquois. And so this map says a lot, and it also says something about who we are and who they are. All of the Indian groups are circles, all of the European groups are squares. So, in some sense, it is saying something about perhaps the grid-like streets of Charleston, or it's saying something about that group being other, they're different, they're foreign. So going back to Nicholas King's map, and I'm going to bring this together, I swear. Here we have this perfectly Cartesian, Jeffersonian map of the world with all of the BS erased from it, right? But there's still some in there. There is this wonderful little native map right in the middle of this thing. And so this was all based on Aaron Arrowsmith's map, and Aaron Arrowsmith had all the greatest intelligence of the time, and it includes the latest stuff from Peter Fiddler of the Hudson's Bay Company. And he even called the map a map exhibiting all the new discoveries in the interior parts of North America. Well, this was Peter Fiddler's map. Peter Fiddler copied this from Akamoki, who was a Blackfeet chief. And he was up here at the Red Deer and the Saskatchewan rivers at this place called Chesterfield House. And Akamoki drew him this map. Yeah, I'll show you what the upper Missouri looks like. You've got the Rockies, and we've got this mountain. We call this the King Mountain, and we call this the Heart Mountain, and we call this the Bear's Tooth Mountain. And over here we have the Bear Paws. And there's all these rivers that go into the Missouri there, and they drain from the Rockies. And there you go, right? So Peter Fiddler passes this information along to the Hudson's Bay Company, They send it to London. London gives it to Aaron Arrowsmith. Aaron Arrowsmith publishes his map. Nicholson copies his map, erases the Rockies going south, but leaves the ones with names. And this is the only map we have of the interior where we see actual names. And guess whose names they are? They're Akamoki's name. We have the King Mountain, we have the Heart Mountain, and we have the Bear's Tooth Mountain right here, which has changed to Boar's Tooth. And then we have this sort of set of drainages, right? So they've taken Akamoki's highly schematic map and made it into this sort of, you know, it's like, hey, that looks legit. Right, they fudged it, okay? So these are fudged rivers, and we have the fudged Yellowstone and the fudged Missouri, all right? And then no Rockies extending south, because Akamoki didn't say if there was anything there. And so we have William Clark going upriver. He's using maps that were drawn by natives. He's using maps that were copies of maps that were drawn by natives. And as they go upriver, on 30 separate occasions, they get either verbal or, and on 9 occasions of those, they get physical maps made for them of the way ahead. So when they're at the Mandan villages, Big White Cheheki gives them these directions to the Yellowstone based on a verbal description. We have this map that the Cutnose did as a relief map with piles of sand on the ground, and Clark used that. We have this map that was done at Fort Clatsop, where a Clatsop just drew the coastline for them in a schematic way, and the rivers associated with it, places that they hadn't been, give them an idea of, you know, what the landscape looked like. So given all of that, we can see how Tune's map sort of fits in this tradition at this point. Are you still with me? All right. And Tune includes lots of extra bits of stuff. So these are historical documents, but what's special about this one is it's a historical document that includes the present. And we have these drawings of the council between the Arikara, and we have Captain Clark and Captain Lewis. And they're almost like they're these ambassadors who've come in and they're settling our differences. We're having these great councils, you know, people are getting together. It's good stuff. They brought a really weird boat. I got to draw a picture of that because these are the boats that we've been using. And, you know, so this was unusual. Everything that was happening, it was noteworthy. It was worth putting on an important document. And the sort of milieu that Tune was living in, just to sort of give you a sense of what it was like. These are the kinds of middle Missouri villages they were living in. This is a painting of George Catlin's of the Mandan, but they had largely the same physical culture. There's your bull boat sitting out on the roof. There were semi-subterranean houses that they would move occasionally as the land got infertile and they needed to move their fields. The Arikara were a very large group of people by the end of the 1600s. They occupied a huge section of the Missouri River. They were these sort of late Mississippian maize agriculturalists living this sort of complex lifestyle. And when they occupied and abandoned 175 different villages. And so they were all over the place. And they just got wiped out and wiped out and wiped out with multiple smallpox epidemics. So waves of disease moved through the community. And in typical like Mississippian fashion, they would just aggregate and aggregate and aggregate until they were down to just 3 villages at the time of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this is sort of an aerial shot of what's called a double ditch site on the middle of Missouri to give you an idea of what one of these abandoned villages looked like. They had these sort of exterior fortifications, and then as the houses collapse, they leave these little craters. So now let's look at Tune's map, given all this context. So Tune was a well-traveled person. He spoke 11 languages. He had a very detailed understanding of the geopolitical situation that he lived in. And so over here on the sort of far, saying south or north is not really the right way to orient yourself to this map, because the key feature is, of course, the Missouri River, the sacred water that runs through the middle of the universe. And so there was a very important thing to the Arikara, and their world was oriented to it. So the map is oriented to the Missouri. So way off somewhere here, we have some mountains, and we have this fascinating thing, and it says the lake with the moving rocks. And I cannot find anything about that, and once again, I welcome any suggestions. This is somewhere on the mountains on the way to New Mexico, because here we have Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there are a bunch of squares. Down here on the lower Missouri, we have the Omaha, we have the Skeety, we have the Pawnee, and we have the Missouris. And this is the Platte River, and this is the Rivière qui court. So we have a lot of these sort of old French names, and we're going to be publishing a full translation of this thing, and we proceeded on in May. So don't stress about this. I can send you the file, I guess. So anyway, so that's that close up, and so that's, here's the Northwest Company. They're also squares. So they're down here, and then we have this Rivière or Northwest. And how many of you know about the White Earth River from the Lewis and Clark maps or journals? So there was this expectation of there being this White Earth River, and it's sort of the river that doesn't exist. And they saw this flooded little short, estuary thing coming in, and oh, this must be the White Earth River, but they didn't go up it and check. And so there's this huge river on their map that isn't there. Anyway, so that may be due to misunderstandings like this particular one. So this Riviera au Northwest is not a river. It's the route you take to get to Fort Assiniboine. And there's no river there. And this sort of gives you an example of it. So the Northwest Company was sending people down to the Mandan villages from Fort Assiniboine all the time. The expedition mentioned 2 cases of that at least, where Northwest Company people were sort of showing up or getting killed in the vicinity of the Mandan villages. And if we zoom in on this Northwest Company map of the Great Bend of the Missouri, because they were going down there, and here we have Turtle Hill, because there's a Turtle Hill right here. We have a path going up north, and it meets up with the Mouse River, the Souris River, and heads on up to the Northwest Company. So that river wasn't so much a river as a route. Here we have a close-up of the meeting between the Arikara and the Lewis and Clark expedition on October 10th of 1804, where we delivered a similar speech to those delivered. The Ottos and Sioux made 3 chiefs. That's a key phrase right there, made them, so they had to pick amongst the many dignitaries available, 1 for each village, and gave them clothes and large flags, right? So he meets with 3 leaders of the Arikara villages and gives them flags, but then we have over here, hey, there's a Conseil de different nations, right? We have a council of different nations. Captain Lewis, Captain Clark, and the Cheyenne are represented. And we have 3 paths going. So what happened on October 12th of 1804 was 3 Cheyenne guys showed up, and Clark spoke to them, and they talked as well. So that gets conflated in this map as one event. Down here we have the Dakota. And the Arikara had a very complicated relationship with the Dakota, insofar as they were good customers, but they kept robbing them all the time. So they had a relationship, but it wasn't a good one, but they didn't really want to mess with it because they were also good customers. But they recognized that there was a relationship between the different bands of Dakota, even if there was not a relationship between the Dakota and the Arikara. Here we have the Great Bend of the Missouri, the Mandan and Arikara villages, and we have that great council again with Captain Lewis, Captain Clark, the canoe. At the conclusion of the speech, we mentioned the Arikaras and requested them to make a peace and smoke out of the sacred stem with their chief, which introduced and gave him the pipe of peace to pass around, yada yada. With all eagerness, they smoked with their Kitanarshar. So this is a really important diplomatic moment for Tune. It gets included in this map. This is an important part of the story. Hey, we made peace with the Mandan, right? That's good stuff. It's something to put on the resume. And we have the various Mandan villages and the Hidatsa villages and their relationships with one another. And we have the Mandans, the little Mandans, les siffleurs, the whistlers, a petit village gros ventre, and that was a word for the Hidatsa or the Minatari. and a big village of the Minatari. Moving down on the upper Missouri, and so there's this break right here where the Missouri, see right here on the map, we have the Missouri goes this way. This is the Yellowstone. So the sort of notion of the headwaters being on the Missouri branch, they had a different idea about that. The Yellowstone branch was more significant to Tune. But up there on the Missouri, he knew what was going on because we have the River of the Crees, we have the Assiniboine, and we have the Gros Ventre, so the Atsina, and Les Pieds Noirs, the Blackfeet. So he knew he was there, he knew what their relationships were geographically at least, even though he didn't understand their interrelationships politically. And up here in the far right corner, we have, it says Les Alitans. Aliatane was one of the words, exonyms for the Shoshone, and Les gens du serpent, so the snake people, also another name for the Shoshone. And we have the Crow, and we have right here the Chevatoon. And then we have these sort of mytho-historical things on this map. There's more than just politics here. There's also history, and there's also religion. We have this thing here, this turtle lake. So we have an image of a turtle, and it's drawn inside of this lake, and it's following the river, the Gros Ventre. That's the Knife River. And it says, the turtle that carried 56 men and drowned them. And this is part of an old Arikara story about, a sort of a sacred story about an important event in their past. And this place was something that people came and gave offerings at. So that's what these little marks are, people coming and leaving offerings after going up the Knife River route. And also nearby was this place here, the Place où l'on consulte le destin. And this is the place where one consults destiny. And this is an intriguing thing. Once again, we have these markings for people coming and making offerings. So in a journal, William Clark's journal of October 21st, he writes about this. A quarter of a mile past the mouth of the Heart River, 38 yards wide, this river heads near Turtle Mountain with Knife River. On this river is a smooth stone, which the Indians have great faith in and consult the stone on all great occasions, which they say marks or symbols are left on the stone of what is to take place. So this is an active rock art site. And down below, he makes another mention of people going back down to visit the stone, which informs them of everything. So that's included on this map. And then we have other things that were just sort of either historically important, ritually important, or just plain interesting. So right here we have literally the oldest thing on this map. This is the beginning of the whole story that is this landscape. And this is Le Lac de la Vache, eau empoisonnée. And so it's Buffalo Lake or Bison Lake, and the water is poisoned. And when the Arikara have their story of their emergence from a hole in the ground, the first place they went to was this lake. And a mythical beast with horns of a bison called the Cutnose came out and attacked them. And so this is sort of the beginning of time is on this map. Down sort of closer to the Arikara home, we have, it's an interesting site. We have a chien petrifié and femme petrifiée. So a petrified woman and a petrified dog. And I imagine that had a very interesting story associated with it. We have this place here, the cave where crows gather in abundance. So you have a sort of weird natural feature. Here's a crazy cave where you can see a ton of crows. And we also have this place here, the earthen pyramid, where the Indians take the birds. So this was a butte that is a sacred eagle-catching site. So that's an important ceremonial site, so it had to also be included on the map. So this is how maps were sort of made. This is probably what those maps looked like as they were given to the expedition as they were going upriver. And these kinds of stories of turtles and snakes and what have you were included in the sort of geographic intelligence that the expedition was getting from Native people. And so that's all I've got. And I would love some questions. Yeah?
How did the Missouri River come up to being the main route? I mean, who established, decided this is the main means of where it's going?
It was such a broad river, and it looked like a navigable eastern river. What I should have showed you on that slide from the 1755 Mitchell map, there's a little notation on the Missouri that says it extends in the opposite direction just as far as the Ohio does and is just as navigable. And so there was this assumption that the geographic landscape was symmetrical. And it's sort of like if you have a blank space on the map, if there's something in the world that you don't know, you assume something about it until you prove otherwise. And so these maps were sort of drawn with assumptions on them, but they're biased assumptions where they didn't have actual distances. They knew a river existed, but they had a schematic map of it. And so they couldn't say much about it, but they sort of decided to think a lot of things about it. And so the Missouri gained that importance as being apparently navigable all the way up. But navigable to whom? People using bull boats? It was not being used at that point in time in that way by the people they were asking about its navigability. Yeah.
Kevin, what were all the Native American maps that you showed us written or drawn on?
Oh, the medium. In the journals, there are lots of different media that people use, and most of them are extremely expedient. I mean, the exception is, of course, a document like Tunes or a document like a birch bark scroll. These sort of ceremonial documents that were preserved in medicine bundles are extremely valuable and had to be taken care of. But maps that were just directions, like the Lewis and Clark expedition was not asking for the history of anybody. They wanted directions. And at one point in Clark's journals, he sounds kind of impatient with Tunis. He keeps talking too much about all this stuff. And can you clarify again? Sorry, I got lost in that thought.
I just wonder what they...
Oh, the medium, right. So what the expedition was encountering were different mediums for different people. In some cases, they were drawn on white elk skins. And Clark made a point there was a map of sort of Columbia drainages that was a collaboration of 3 different native guides. One was Nez Perce, one was Walla Walla, one was something else I can't remember. But it was a remarkable map, and he made a point of making a copy of it and keeping it. And so he wasn't using it. And that map got destroyed in a fire at the University of Virginia in 1895, so we don't have it anymore. But most of the time, it'd be someone could draw something on the ground. They could offer them paper, here, draw on this, use some charcoal, here's a pencil. People would draw on hides. People would draw on woven mats with charcoal. So that's one of the things that gets described a lot on the Lewis and Clark expedition is charcoal on a mat or on a hide. And so it was not really, any more than you'd sketch something on the back of an envelope. It was a similar sort of activity, like, oh, you want directions? Okay, here. Anything else? Yeah, Chip.
Kevin, were there any battles or wars fought over competing maps? People fighting over their version of...
Were there fights over boundaries? Yeah, basically. The War of 1812? I mean, yeah, the War of 1812, the French and Indian War, I mean, it was all about boundaries, and that was what was important about Chegary's map. Where are the French allied Indians at so we can fight them? Where are the boundaries between these groups of people? And you have these distinctly disturbing phenomena that resulted from that. A story of one of these early French fur traders was going down the Mississippi River, and there was a conflict. You see on all these old French maps this group of people called the Tamaroa, and they're right at the sort of confluence of the Illinois and the Mississippi River. And the last Tamaroan, or at least Tamaroan speaker, died like 30 years ago. And they were decimated by the French and Indian War because they allied with the wrong guys, and the sort of nearby Iroquoians made a point of coming out and killing them all. And the warriors were going to cut the Iroquois off at the pass and left the village with the elderly and the children. And this fur trader is coming downriver and is greeted by the sight of all these people standing on the bank. And when he gets there, he realizes they're motionless, and they've all been killed and put on stakes by the river as a warning. And so, you know, that was a French and Indian War fueled thing. So that, you know, that was about pushing boundaries around the, you know, the first battle that the U.S. Army lost against Indians in, was it 1797 in Ohio? They pushed in there, their supply chains were too short, and, you know, they were fighting over where, you know, where the boundaries are of the old Northwest. And so, yeah, it's happened a lot in this continent. Yeah.
Did Lewis and Clark draw their own maps, and it seemed to me that they brought some science, some instruments and things along to determine where your locations, longitude, latitude, that sort of thing?
Yeah.
So did they use any of these maps as their base, or did they draw totally new maps? Or how?
Well, it was this, you know, a series of revisions as they went along. There was sort of like assumptions, redrawings, and if I'm correct on that, Richie, he's probably the best person to ask about that. But it seemed to be a process of constant, you know, assumption, revision, assumption, revision. Yeah, Susan.
Are there native groups who still draw schematic maps, like aside from the year calendars? Like, is it still a tradition?
I don't know. I believe amongst the Sioux is the only one I know of for sure that still maintain maps and medicine bundles. But it's like, once again, you have to be a ritual specialist to ever see one. So I wouldn't know what it looks like, other than what people have said it looks like. They were allowed to see it. Sort of like a document at the House Intelligence Committee. Current events joke. Anything else? And I brought a physical copy of the map if anyone wants to sort of look at it on paper. It's a little easier to look at that way if you want to meet with me afterward. All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody.